This lecture is on the nature of knowledge, contemporary epistemology, and the traditional theory of knowledge. Pushing the problem of skepticism aside now, it seems pretty clear that the word knowledge or to know can mean a number of different things, right? So we have basic cases of knowledge, like that you can see your own hands, that you know what things are in the refrigerator or how to make a sandwich. But then there's also scientific cases of knowledge, right? Really complicated cases like knowing, about gravity, how to calculate the orbit of planets, or what's going on at the biological or subatomic level. Um, Experimental data sometimes seems to count as certain kinds of scientific knowledge, and then there's things that are proven by science versus things that are conjectured, and so there's this sort of leveling understanding of what things in science we count as actually knowing, and things that just seem to be suggested by the science, but we don't really know them. And then there's people talk about mystical or mythical knowledge of certain sorts, where we've got people like priests or mystics or psychics or Buddhist monks. Maybe they have some kind of deep connection to the ether or to God or to the afterlife or something like that. Now, the way that we use the word knowledge, um, in, as far as I can tell, is actually in some ways a problem for generic skepticism about everything. And the reason here is a little bit, I think, subtle, but bear with me. First, mystical knowledge, things, we say that people have this like deep understanding of reality or connection with God. These kinds of bits of information are kind of hard to prove, right? So it's if someone, says that they can tell the future, you can ask them how they're doing it, and they don't really seem to be able to show you. So here, when it comes to things like mystical knowledge, it seems like, general skepticism of the practice might be justified, right? It seems pretty justified. Scientific knowledge, right? The way what we talk about when we talk about doing science, it's always kind of hard to understand what the knowledge is, and hard to understand how it is that people have gone about accumulating that knowledge. There's lots of room for disagreement in science, and there's lots of kind of difficulty in checking and proving scientific data. And so, because of this sort of difficulty in sort of understanding scientific knowledge, it seems that some kind of what we might call epistemic humility often seems justified, where we take some kind of attitude that's aware of the limits of our own understanding and aware of the limits of what science can actually sort of prove and show beyond a reasonable doubt, right? There are things that science can't do, and then there are things that science does very well, and you need to actually study up on the science in order to figure out those sorts of things. But so here, even something along the lines of like a minimal amount of skepticism can be justified because science is hard and people get it wrong sometimes. However, when it comes to common knowledge, the things that we know in our everyday lives, it just seems like it's everywhere and everyone has it, right? You know what you look like, you know what your mother's name is, you know what you had for breakfast this morning and that you brush your teeth, you know how to get to the nearest grocery store. These uses of the word to know and the kinds of knowledge that accompanies them seem simple and basic and easy to have. And so skepticism, the idea that no one ever has knowledge or knowledge doesn't exist or that it's really hard to get knowledge, any kind of skepticism of a broad sort seems to be bound for failure simply because it seems to misuse the word knowledge when it comes to not recognizing that there are all these common cases. If the skeptic wants to say, oh yeah, but do you really know how to get to the grocery store? You want to say, yeah, yes, clearly I do. You're misusing that word. You're trying to put some emphasis on that word that isn't there. Sure, maybe I don't know that there are subatomic particles because I can't see them or something like that, but that doesn't mean I don't know how to get to the grocery store. That's an easy case. So in rejecting this sort of outlandish kind of skepticism that seems a little bit too extreme, most people are willing to accept what we might call the standard view of knowledge. The standard view of knowledge is sort of what an everyday person probably accepts. One, that we tend to know a lot of things, right? There's lots of things that we know. Of course, there are lots of things that we don't know, but we tend to know a lot of things. And that there are a number of different ways by which we can gain knowledge, a number of different ways of knowing. Now, a normal person might not have these things top of mind, but at least they could, agree with some of these cases. In particular, ways of knowing are things like, perception, you can perceive things; memory, you can remember things; testimony, people can tell you things and you can come to know that way; introspection, where, you sort of think internally about your own states of mind, your own thoughts, your own feelings; reasoning, you can you can sit and you can actually do some logic or reason from evidence to a conclusion; and maybe rational intuition or insight, where sometimes it seems like we're able to just come to know or understand certain things simply by kind of peering into them, mentally, without actually doing a whole lot of reasoning. The standard view is the kind of thing that we should probably accept on the whole as regular human individuals, and I think philosophy kind of pans this out. There are, of course, other challenges to this view, the view that we commonly know a lot of things and that there are these basic, certain ways, different ways of knowing, many ways of knowing. And the other, the other challenges besides skepticism are what we might think of as relativism, nihilism, and scientism. However, I think, again, whatever it is that knowledge is, whatever it is that we think we're talking about when we're talking about whether or not we know things, or what we know, or who knows what, or how knowledge works, it does seem like there's some pretty clear-cut rules to the game, which we'll go into. The rules, requirements that must be met in order to count as knowing. And if there are rules to the game that, requirements that must be met in order to count as knowing, then it's not just a free-for-all. And so relativism is out. Relativism would be like, look, the rules to the game are just made up and none of the points matter, right? Like anyone can know whatever they want, however they want, in whatever way they want. That seems wrong. There seem to be some pretty strict rules that we'll go into. And so relativism seems problematic. Similarly, nihilism seems problematic because it seems like clearly we're talking about something when we're talking about knowing things, when we're talking about knowledge itself. And nihilism is basically just the view that there is no such thing as knowledge, right? Knowledge doesn't exist. And so that would be crazy. Like, how could something that we're talking about, like knowing something, not exist? And how could you even be a nihilist? Because trying to be a nihilist would be like saying that you know that nothing exists, or you know that knowledge doesn't exist, which is just dumb. Similarly, scientism. Scientism is a kind of challenge to the standard view that is more and more popular these days, but people are confused, I think, because it's just kind of dumb to think that all knowledge comes from science and can only be gotten by doing science. If by science all you mean is like doing rational reflection and collecting evidence, then sure, right? Maybe you're right. All knowledge is got by that, but that's not science. Like when we're talking about science, we're talking about usually empirical data collecting, experimentation. But there's lots of knowledge that doesn't come by means of that sort of thing. Science is great. Science is, where all of our greatest achievements in knowledge come from, where all of our greatest breakthroughs come from. But we shouldn't sort of blindly give all of our allegiance over to science as if it's like the new religion. This leads us to the traditional analysis of knowledge. Now, an analysis is basically a kind of thing where you try to take some concept and break it down into its underlying subconcepts. You try and analyze the larger concept and show how the subconcepts kind of fit together in order to make the bigger concept up. Knowledge, as we recognize it, is what we might call propositional. meaning that when you know something, usually, in particular cases, what you know is a proposition. So we usually use this sort of turn of phrase, Sally knows that the sky is blue, right? Here, the phrase that the sky is blue expresses a proposition or statement, and there's information that's in that sentence, in that phrase. There's information that's expressed, and the information expressed there by the phrase that the sky is blue is what Sally knows in this case, right? The sentence, Sally knows that the sky is blue, expresses a relationship that holds between Sally and this bit of information, right, that the sky is blue. The same kind of knowledge, the same proposition, the same bit of information can be known by a number of different people, basically anyone that's in the same position that Sally is with respect to how Sally came to know, right? So, Sally could see that the sky is blue, or somebody could tell her that the sky is blue, or maybe Sally remembers that the sky is blue. These are all ways of knowing, and ways of knowing these propositions, ways of knowing these bits of information. It doesn't matter, like if, that Sally speaks English or German or, whatever, the information is the same, even if you express it differently by speaking different languages. And so ultimately, though, where this comes down on is that knowledge statements come, basically, for the most part, in the form S knows that P, where we're talking about a subject S and P a proposition, and basically for any proposition that you want to stick in there, any sentence is gonna do fine. Now, in order to sort of give a good analysis on the basis of thinking about knowledge in terms of these S knows that P type sentences, what we want to know is when sentences of this form are true. And basically what that means is, like, what is it that makes sentences of this form true, right? We've got these sentences distilled down, right? We've taken the proposition out because it doesn't really matter what the proposition is. If someone knows it, then great, like that they stand in a certain relationship to that proposition, that a bit of information. And we've taken the subject out, right? We don't need, it's not the case that a particular individual needs to be in this sentence in order for us to understand what it is for someone to know something. But what we want is to know what it is that makes it true that S knows that P for any basic person and proposition, right? And so what we're looking for are the conditions under which these kinds of sentences come out true. So basically, we're looking for what's called the truth conditions of sentences of the form S knows that P. And to do this, we need to think about basic cases, right? So think about particular cases that you have come across where it's clear as day to you that people know things, and start to try and piece together what's similar about those cases. And then also think about cases in which people don't know things and what's similar about those cases, and then try and compare and contrast them. So what exactly are some situations where people claim to know things, but you aren't so sure that they do, right? Like, let's think about like political pundits or internet posts, right? Or your uncle's weird raving rants. These kinds of cases are situations in which someone says they know something, but you're pretty much like, do you? Suppose we come across a case in where someone claims to know something, but that thing turns out to be demonstrably false. Did they really know that thing? Right? Take the case of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus knew that by sailing west he would reach India. Or Donald Trump. Donald Trump knew that he was going to win the 2020 election. Now, both of these cases can't really be cases of knowledge, right? Because they're wrong, right? Christopher Columbus couldn't reach India by sailing west. I mean, he would have had to sail west and south and then back north, and he couldn't. From where he left, he was gonna hit a whole continent between him and India. And Donald Trump didn't know that he was going to win the 2020 election because he didn't. He lost the 2020 election. So it seems that in order to know something, you can claim that you know something, but if it's not true, if it doesn't actually occur, if the bit of information that you say you know isn't actually the case, isn't a fact, then you don't know it, So the information or proposition, it seems, in order to know it, must be true. Now, normally, when we see people that fail to know something that they, were thinking was true, we don't attribute knowledge to them, right? When someone fails to know something, we don't say, oh, they knew that. Of course not, right? Because they failed to know. But we do see that they are kind of taking a commitment, taking a standpoint, trying to commit themselves to the thing that they're thinking, the particular bit of information, the proposition that they had before them, right? They thought that proposition was true, and that's why they, claimed to know it. Now, what exactly is this position where someone takes a stance or an attitude towards a bit of information, but, maybe they don't actually know it in the end? Well, this state we generally call the state of belief, right? Believing is the kind of thing in which a person takes a stance towards the truth of a bit of information, whether or not that information is actually true or not, right? They believe that information. So the following, two statements seem to be true given the previous page. Christopher Columbus believed that by sailing west he would reach India, and Donald Trump believed that he would win the 2020 election. They were both wrong, but it's true to say that they believed these things. Now, belief seems to be the kind of thing that's also a requirement for knowledge. You can take and you can see this by thinking about cases where people sort of don't really fully believe something, but, they're in the vicinity of belief. So take things like cases like sports prediction. So suppose we say, a couple years ago, Scott knew that the Lakers were going to win the championship. Now, supposing that the Lakers did eventually win, could Scott really have known that the Lakers were going to win the championship back in the day? Now, maybe, it is true. It's true that the Lakers did win. And maybe Scott had some good reasons for thinking that they would win. But did Scott really take a full-on truth stance with respect to the proposition that the Lakers would win the championship? Did he really know before? Could anyone really have known before it actually happened? Probably he couldn't. And the reason is because there's something like a difference between believing something and hoping that that thing is true, right? And one of the ways that we can tell this difference, oftentimes, is by taking stock in what people are betting, how people might bet, or how people might act with respect to information that they have. So question, how much are you willing to bet on what your mother's name is, right? What you think it is, right? Versus how much are you willing to bet on who will win the next Super Bowl, right? You probably have a vastly different betting scheme here. You're probably willing to take any bet. If someone thinks that, they know your mom's name better than you, you better take that bet, right? Because that's absurd. You know what your mom's name is. The other person might as well, but that's you'd feel like you were being tricked or something, right? You're pretty certain. You're 100%, right? You're very committed to the truth of the proposition that your mom's name is whatever, Karen. But for any football team, who's going to win the next Super Bowl? That's totally up in the air. You might have all the faith in the world for your team, right? That they're going to do it. They're going to pull it off. But can you even get to the point at which you believe that they're going to win? Can you really fully commit to the truth there in the same way that you can commit to the truth that of what you believe your mom's name to be? Having faith that some proposition is true is different than believing that that proposition is true. You might be committed to the truth of a proposition, say, that God exists, or that Donald Trump will lose the next election, something like that. But you're going to act differently in cases of faith than in cases of belief, right? Beliefs are certain kinds of truth-aimed commitments. You actually commit yourself to the piece of information in a belief, whereas hope or faith are truth-aimed. You hope that something comes to pass. You have faith that something is currently true, even if you don't, have full access to all the information. But the level of commitment is different for each of these, right? Especially for beliefs in comparison to hopes and faith. Now, sometimes people overcommit to things that are false. That is, they overcommit to their hopes or overcommit to their faith, and so they end up having beliefs in these things that where they really shouldn't, right? This is where we get things like wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is like where you start to believe that something's going to happen. Like say you're a gambler and you're like, oh, it's my turn. I'm going to win the next one. The next one's on me. You shouldn't be taking that hope, that desire to win, and turning it into a real belief, right? It just doesn't. It's just not going to live up to your expectations. But ultimately, the idea here is just to point out that what it is to be committed to a piece of information when you hope that it's true or when you have faith that it's true is different than being committed to a piece of information when you believe that it's true. So now we've got truth and belief as requirements for knowledge. But is that all? Is true belief enough? When you have a belief, you're committed to the truth of something, and it's true, is that enough to know? Well, suppose you come to believe something after being hit on the head, and that thing just turns out to be true, right? So like, bang, you get smacked on the head by a falling apple, and all of a sudden you inexplicably believe that the moon is on average 384,400 kilometers distant from Earth. That is true. Did you just stumble onto a piece of knowledge? It seems very unlikely that that counts as knowledge. Cases of luck, where you come to have a true belief, show that we need more than just true belief in order to know. If in this case it counts as, just true belief counts as knowledge, then lucky true belief should count as knowledge as well. But we don't want to say that a person that simply, comes to have a true belief by random chance, that they actually know what it is that they believe in this case, right? We need good reasons for holding the beliefs that we have. And good reasons for the beliefs that we have are called justifiers or justifying reasons. And when a belief is held on the basis of good reasons, and we don't have defeaters for those reasons, we don't have other reasons for thinking that those reasons are bad reasons, then we have what's called a justified belief. Beliefs are justified by justifiers, and justified beliefs come about when a belief is, all things considered, more, there are better reasons for believing it than not. Sadly, however, sometimes we have justified beliefs, but they're not true. Imagine any situation in which you've had a good reason to believe something, but it's turned out to not be the case, right? Suppose you read the time on an invitation to a party just before, and you end up going to the party at that time, but you read the time on the invitation on the Evite or whatever right before the host changed the time and re-sent out a bunch of invitations. You get to the party, you think starts at 7, but it doesn't. Well, in this case, it seems like you had a good reason for believing that the party started at 7. You had a justified belief that the party started at 7, but it was false because, somebody changed the time of the party. Now, in this case, you're in some sense not really at fault for your false belief, but, because you had a good reason for thinking, and it's the kind of, it's the kind of reason that we all recognize as a good reason for believing what you believed. You had a justified belief, but it wasn't enough. Now, there's a bit of a difference between being justified in having a belief, that is like having a reason for your belief, and being able to show that you're actually justified in a belief that you have. Being able to show that you're justified involves proving that the reason that you have for your belief is actually a good reason for your belief. Now, those are two separate things. Simply having a good reason and being able to show that it is a good reason are, very, very different. Sometimes we believe things on the basis of good reasons that we are ultimately unaware of. But those reasons don't go away. They still exist. Sometimes they are still good reasons. And sometimes those good reasons still confer justification. So we're still justified in the beliefs that we have, even if we're unable to point out or explain why it is that the reasons that we're relying on are really good reasons. Think about this kind of case. Why, in the end, do you trust the deliverances of your visual perception, what you see? Is it because you're aware that your visual perception is a reliable source of the truth? Well, maybe, but you couldn't, and you probably don't, think about that very often. And it's really doubtful that you could show how this is, right? Very few people are actually perceptual science experts and are able to sort of show how it is that, the light patterns reflecting off your retina and the way that your brain works is actually like a good representation of reality outside the world and so reliable as a source of information and knowledge. Like, that's crazy, right? But those are all good reasons for thinking, that are sort of in the background behind your thinking that, what you see is what is out there in the world, right? When you see the red ball bouncing, right, you can trust your perceptual apparatus to represent the red ball bouncing, but you're justified in your belief that the red ball is bouncing on the basis of seeing it, even if you don't know or are unable to prove behind the scenes how all of that justificatory story works. Justification, or sometimes called warrant, is a rather complex issue. There's lots of facets and interesting ins and outs for thinking about what exactly it is to have a good reason for a belief that you have. Epistemologists pretty much, focus on the nature of justification when they're thinking about knowledge and try to figure out what exactly it is to have a good reason for believing something. In the rest of this sort of section, we're going to be talking a lot about different theories and kinds of justification. Ultimately, though, the sort of first thing we need to ask is whether or not now we've got an adequate analysis of knowledge. Is it really the case that just having justified true beliefs, is that enough for us to count as knowing something? If I have a belief in something and it's true and I have a good reason for believing it, is that it? Does that count as knowledge? Or do we also need something else? According to Edmund Gettier, justified true belief is not enough for knowledge. And he gives a number of counterexamples, which we will look at in the next video.